Just before the commencement of the battle, and after taking a minute survey of his troops on the position, the Duke rode down to Hougoumont, and following the footpath that traversed the wood, halted at the eastern boundary, from whence he surveyed the enemy's masses in that vicinity. He afterwards returned to the buildings, and casting a hasty glance around, made a few observations to Colonel McDonnell, ordered a slight change to be made in the troops holding the wood and outgrounds, and then he rode away. At about 11:30 o'clock, his Grace was near the bit of hedgerow on the roadside, about midway between the Lion and Hougoumont, in conversation with one of his staff, when a strong force of light troops of Prince Jerome's division commenced an attack in the wood of Hougoumont upon our light troops, who being under cover of the hedge and trees kept them at bay for some time. The French, however, pressed on briskly into the wood, and drove our troops back towards the buildings. The rattle of the musketry was kept up in the wood for some time, and thus opened the memorable day of Waterloo. Upon Jerome's supporting columns being put in motion, about 10 minutes to 12, according to Lord Edward Somerset and General Shaw Kennedy's watches, Captain Cleave's German battery first opened upon them, and produced a most terrific effect, making a complete road through the mass. The leading column was broken, and fell back behind the ridge, upon which our artillery more to the right opened upon the French rear columns, which had slightly changed their position. Ryler's guns now opened, and a heavy cannonade was carried on. Napoleon ordered Kellerman to push forward his horse batteries. Thus the fire augmented like thickening peals of thunder, and the whole kept up a continual roar. And from their deep throats the shot and shells did pour. Our Nassau and Hanoverian light troops were forced out of the wood by the French, when the light companies of the British Guards advanced on the right of the buildings, and also from the orchard into the fields, driving the enemy before them. During the time the French occupied the wood, the Duke, after explaining the danger attending the howitzer's range, as, from the proximity of the hostile forces, friends might be destroyed as well as foes, ordered Bull's howitzer battery to throw shells into it. A shower of shells was soon sent flying into the wood, which forced Jerome's light troops and their supports to retire. Up to this time, except a little skirmishing, the battle was confined to Hougoumont. The roar of artillery was increasing. At this period, a body of the enemy's cavalry approached our left at a good pace, upon which Best's Hanoverians formed square. But the French cavalry went about. It was a reconnoitring party to see whether we had thrown up any field works, as our position, when seen from the French right, had all the appearance of being intrenched. Fresh columns of Jerome's division, supported by Foy's, were sent upon our post at Hougoumont. They united, extended their front, and pressed through the wood and open fields. The horse battery upon the French left opened upon our right, and a sharp cannonade was kept up between the batteries. Our light troops in the wood and orchard made a desperate resistance, but were ultimately obliged to fall back upon the flanks of the buildings. As the French approached the banked-up hedge that masked the loopholed wall, they pressed up to it, thinking our troops were behind it. But they were suddenly brought to a stand by an efficacious fire through the loopholes and from the scaffold over the top of the wall. Most of their advance were brought down, and those who followed were staggered, not being able to make out whence the fire came that made such havoc in their ranks, little thinking that a masked battery of muskets was within 40 yards of them. They at length perceived whence this well-directed fire came. Still they returned with redoubled fury to the attack, in hopes of carrying this important post. Not thinking it prudent to attempt an escalade, they covered themselves, as best they could, by the banked-up hedge and trees, and continued a dropping fire upon the wall, which was so peppered as to lead one to suppose they had an idea of battering it down with musketry, or mistook the red bricks for our red coats. At length some of the more daring, and there were many in their ranks, rushed over the hedge up to the wall, and seized the muskets which protruded through the loopholes. The enemy were making their way out of the wood, through a gap, into the large orchard, when Lord Saltoun charged them with his light troops, and drove them back. Our howitzers upon the right of the main ridge began again plying with shells the enemy in the wood, they falling back, and our men moving on slowly, the shells were thrown in another direction, upon some supports. The enemy were again reinforced and pressed on in a most daring manner. Our guards on the right, under Colonel McDonnell, fell back upon the haystack, afterwards burnt, that stood between the buildings and the wood, and upon the hedges and the right enclosures, while those on the left or orchard side, under Colonel Lord Saltoun, fell back to the south, banked-up hedge of the orchard. Those on the right were assisted by their comrades from the windows of the house, as well as from the loopholes of the south stables. They managed upon that point to keep the enemy at bay for some time, but perceiving some of Jerome's troops outflanking them on the allied right of the buildings, thus exposing our men to the danger of being turned on their right and cut off from retreat, they hastily fell back and entered the buildings by the north gate, which they attempted to block up. But the French were too close upon them, and forced an entrance. Our men, quickly taking the best cover they could find, opened a rattling fire upon the intruders, then darted forward, and a struggle ensued, distinguished by the most undaunted courage on both sides. At length Colonel MacDonell and his small force, amongst whom was Sergeant Graham, succeeded in overpowering the enemy and closing the gate. All of the enemy who had entered were either killed or severely wounded. Shortly after, a French soldier climbed to the top of the gateway, and Sergeant Graham immediately shot him by order of Captain Wyndham, who at the time was holding Graham's musket, whilst the latter was further securing the gate. At this moment the position was nearer falling into the hands of the enemy than at any other period during the day. A party of French drove back our light companies and passed the avenue hedge which leads to the Nivelles road, turning the post on the Allied right. Being favoured by the brushwood and high crops, they got close up under the ridge on the right of our main front line and destroyed some of our artillerymen and horses, causing Webber Smith's battery to be drawn back into the hollow road, where his guns were refitted. Colonel Woodford, with the rest of the Coldstreams, went down and drove the French before him. But before his arrival, such a numerous body of the enemy had congregated at the north gate and wall of Hougoumont that our artillery opened fire upon them. Colonel Woodford's advance caused it to cease, from the fear of destroying our own men. Woodford cleared all before him, and leaving a detachment to guard the avenue, he entered the building from the lane by a small door of the barn, now bricked up. Sergeant Graham, some time after this, asked permission to fall out for a few minutes, a request which surprised Colonel MacDonnell and induced him to inquire the motive. Graham replied that his brother was lying in the buildings wounded, and, as the flames were then fast extending, he wished to remove him to a place of safety. The request was granted, and Graham, having rescued his brother from the fate which menaced him, speedily returned to his post. Graham died an inmate of the Royal Hospital, Kilmainham, Dublin, in 1845. The French on our left of Hougoumont pressed on, and turned Lord Saltoun's troops on their left, driving them across the orchard to the friendly hollow way. But upon the enemy following through the south hedge, all within musket range received, from the Coldstreams stationed inside the east garden wall, such a severe fire upon their left flank as staggered and brought them up. Upon which Lord Saltoun, who had been reinforced upon his left by some of the 3rd Guards from the main line, advanced, drove the enemy before him, and again occupied the front hedge, than which there was not a more secure position on the field, as long as the enemy did not outflank it. But this the French frequently attempted to do by attacking, from the open field beyond the east hedge of the enclosure, Saltoun's left, posted at the southeast angle of the orchard. The enemy now occupied the wood and open fields on both flanks. Outside the left enclosures there was cavalry skirmishing. About this time small bodies of cavalry, supposed to be Prussians, were observed on the heights on our left, near Saint-Lambert. In consequence of the determined resistance the enemy met with at our advanced post of Hougoumont, which proved a regular stumbling block to Napoleon.